5, 4, 3.
Hello and welcome to the Scottish Parliament's virtual question time. Today I'm joined by more than 20 members from their homes and constituencies around the country, and by 4 Cabinet Ministers responsible for the Scottish Government's response to the coronavirus outbreak. We're going to go straight into the questions, and I start with question number 1 from Bruce Crawford. Mr. Crawford.
Thank you, President Officer. This is a question for the Cabinet Secretary for Health. Cabinet Secretary, the provision of personal protection equipment for our fantastic staff in both the NHS and the care sector is clearly of vital importance. Can you provide an update on the availability and distribution of the necessary PPE for the emergency services, health and social care workers and third sector partners working with vulnerable people? And when I've got the chance, can I say what a remarkable job you're doing in such trying circumstances?
Cabinet Secretary Jeane Freeman.
Well, can I start by thanking you, Bruce, for that? It's very kind of you. I'll deal with them in 2 separate ways. In terms of availability, you'll know that there are primarily 2 routes to our national stockpile for the NHS in Scotland. The first is the orders that we ourselves place with suppliers for a range of PPE items. That produces the bulk of the stockpile that we have. And secondly, we are part of the UK-wide procurement exercise with our colleagues in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in England to supplement that. In terms of social care, they are providers of their own PPE, but we have agreed to top that up, given that they have additional demand to meet in this emergency situation. So at this point, notwithstanding the global challenge on PPE, because many countries are all chasing the same items, our stock at this point remains viable across all the items of PPE. Our staff work constantly to check on the deliveries, the orders that have been made, that they will come in on time, that they will come in to the volume that we have ordered, and we also have an arrangement across the UK of mutual aid, where it is possible to help each other out in that way. In terms of delivery, we have improved the position in order to ensure that we can cope with the demand in primary and social care. So we have 4 direct distribution routes now. The first of those goes to NHS health boards, where there's a single point of contact for the PPE that they've ordered and received to ensure it is then distributed amongst their hospital settings. The second route is direct to primary care, particularly our GP practices, but also our district nurses, our community nurses, those family practitioners I've spoken about before. The third is to hubs that are largely assisting local authorities and care at home staff, and were up until today also delivering to care homes. From today, we are now making direct deliveries of those additional PPE supplies to care homes, direct to each individual care home. All of this, of course, is a work in progress. We continue to try and improve it. We have that dedicated email address for people who work in health and social care to tell us about problems that they might be encountering, and that is monitored by ministers so that we can act on it straight away.
Cabinet Secretary, thank you very much. This is early on in the session, but could I encourage slightly more concise answers? We've got a lot of members to get through in the time available. I'm going to call Miles Briggs to be followed by Keith Brown. Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And this is a question again for the Health Secretary. Today, the Scottish Government made a further change to PPE distribution in Scotland. This is now the 3rd change in as many weeks. So can I ask, further to that response, how many pieces of PPE will be distributed to care homes in the coming weeks? And will also sheltered housing and housing associations be included?
Jeane Freeman.
So the first thing I have to say is the change we've made today is in direct response to a request from Scottish Care and the third sector providers and suppliers, if you like, of care homes. So this is a government that is reacting to issues and concerns as they arise. In terms of the numbers, I'm not sitting here with those numbers, but I'm very happy to supply those to you, Mr Briggs, after this session. And the other areas that you mentioned, of course, those are local authority responsibilities. For NHS staff who enter those areas, they will be supplied with PPE for the work that they have to do. But where a sheltered home complex is run either by a local authority or a private provider, then they of course have that responsibility to ensure that their staff are given the PPE that they need.
Thank you very much. Keith Brown, to be followed by Monica Lennon. Keith Brown.
This is a question for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. I very much welcome the support that's been provided to businesses by both the UK and Scottish governments so far. However, there are still businesses, including some in my constituency of Clackmannanshire and Dunblane, where they are in danger of falling through the cracks. Can the Finance Secretary outline how the additional support for business that she announced earlier this week will help to support those businesses that are currently facing challenges at the same time as you're waiting for other funding streams to become available?
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
Well, thank you for that question. I am acutely aware of the pressures on businesses, not just in Keith Brown's constituency, but indeed across the country. And we've now exceeded the consequential funding received from the UK government for business support, taking overall support to £2.3 billion. The announcement of an additional phase of funding this week sees £120 million to extend the small business grant scheme, but also, and critically to Keith Brown's question, £100 million in order to support businesses that have fallen through the cracks. So in particular, self-employed people that became self-employed more recently are not going to gain from the UK government's self-employed scheme. So we've tailored our support package to the Scottish economy, where most local economies are dependent on small businesses. And that funding, which will be delivered through local authorities and our enterprise agencies, will be available in May at the latest, ahead of the UK government's June deadline for self-employed support.
Thank you. Monica Lennon, to be followed by Rona Mackay. Monica Lennon.
Thank you. My question is to the Health Secretary, also on PPE. I hear what the Cabinet Secretary said about this being a work in progress, but care homes are the epicentre of this crisis. 1 in 4 COVID deaths have happened in care homes, and I'm really concerned to hear Theresa Fife, the RCN Scotland Director, say just 2 days ago that nursing staff in care homes don't have adequate supplies of PPE. Surely at this stage in the crisis, just one care worker not having enough PPE is one too many, Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
So I'm a little surprised at that, because I spoke to Theresa Fife yesterday along with the BMA, and neither of them had particular issues to raise with me with respect to PPE. So I will of course follow up on that. Can I make the point again about the way in which PPE is supplied to care homes? Of course, you'll know that the majority of our care home sector are private providers. They have a responsibility in terms of their Care Inspectorate registration to ensure that they supply their staff with the right PPE and the training in order to ensure that they can do the job that they are asked to do. We have agreed, in context of this particular emergency, to supplement that provision, and in weekly contact with Donald McCaskill from Scottish Care, we have responded both in that distribution route that I just mentioned, the direct supply, but also to pick up where there are particular issues around PPE. I would make the point that I think we're now in day 108 of this virus. So it is reasonable to say that it's not so much a work in progress, Ms Lennon, more as constantly improving what we do in order to ensure that we continue to deliver to staff what it is they need. Where there are particular instances, we pick that up straight away. And so if there is an issue from RCN, I'll speak to them again this afternoon and make sure that we act on that as quickly as we can.
Thank you. Rona Mackay, to be followed by John Finney. Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. Can the Justice Secretary outline what support the Scottish Government is providing for those who are at heightened risk of domestic abuse while lockdown restrictions are in place?
Cabinet Secretary Humza Yousaf.
I thank Rona Mackay for an extremely... The Government, of course, is providing financial support to organisations such as Scottish Women's Aid, Rape Crisis Scotland. But we know this is about more than just financial support. The messaging from the Government, from support organisations, from Police Scotland, who have been extremely proactive in relation to this matter, is absolutely aligned and absolutely unequivocal. And that messaging is that regardless of how busy services may be, regardless of how busy Police Scotland are, if you are feeling under threat or indeed being harmed by domestic abuse in any of its forms, then you must call the police, and the police will take not just a priority, not just take this as a priority, but take an absolute zero tolerance approach to domestic abuse. Concerns do continue though. We know, for example, that because of the lockdown measures, those who are perpetrators of domestic abuse will be in the house 24/7, other than for, of course, if they have to go out for necessities or their daily exercise. And that may leave little room for those who are victims, including, of course, children, to be able to access support services. So a lot more work is being done with our third sector partners and with Police Scotland to see what more we can do in this. But let the message be absolutely unequivocal. There will be a zero tolerance approach, whether we are in lockdown or out with lockdown to domestic abuse.
Thank you. John Finney, to be followed by Liam Kerr. John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware that there are a considerable number of second homes in the Highlands, and my constituents are deeply concerned that the owners of these properties are ignoring all advice and continuing to travel to the Highlands. I wonder, can the Cabinet Secretary outline what the Scottish Government's done about this, what Police Scotland are doing about it, and will the Cabinet Secretary consider what additional measures could be put in place to protect my constituents from these selfish individuals?
Humza Yousaf.
Well, John Finney is correct that that action is selfish. The Government has been very robust in terms of not just its guidance, but I'd hope our messaging, and Police Scotland equally have been robust in terms of their guidance, but also, I would say, their approach. What I'm happy to do is speak to John Finney offline, get the details in terms of this particular breach of that guidance, and of course he'll know that I speak to the Chief Constable and Police Scotland on a nearly daily basis, because John Finney is absolutely right, and I would echo his comments. Ignoring the guidance is not just selfish, but you are potentially putting yourself at harm, the local services in the Highlands in this case, under undue strain, and there will be action that will be taken against you. So I'm more than happy to take some of the details offline with John Finney and relay them to Police Scotland, and I'm sure action will be taken.
Thank you. Liam Kerr, to be followed by Christine Graham. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Justice. Cabinet Secretary, police officers are on the front line and they must have the correct kit. Now, I understand officers have been issued with single-use surgical masks with the promise that they will protect them. But the Scottish Police Federation are clear in their view that the masks don't offer that protection. So can I ask, what is the evidence on this referred to in Police Scotland's press release yesterday, and will you publish it?
Humza Yousaf.
First and foremost, the full PPE, the enhanced PPE, which includes FFP3 masks, Police Scotland, of course, have sufficient levels of stock, and that is used for when there is a case where police officers have a high risk of being in contact with somebody potentially displaying COVID-19 symptoms. For all other situations where it may not be possible, for example, to apply social distancing measures because of the activities that police carry out, then surgical masks of the type which Liam Kerr refers to will be made available. Now, that is based and aligned very much to the public health guidance, not just here in Scotland, but also by Public Health England as well. So this is UK-wide, 4 nations-wide. guidance that is being applied here, and that is no different to police forces. The guidance that police forces in England and Wales will also be taking. So what I will do in terms of Scottish Police Federation, I saw their concerns in the press. I understand it's based on advice that they've received from their expert panel, which they put together. I've not seen that advice, and I know that the Scottish Police Federation say that they'll make that public shortly. So I look forward to receiving that, and then of course I'm more than happy to feed that into Health Protection Scotland to take a view from them. But let me be absolutely clear on this, having again spoken to the Chief Constable on a near daily basis, that I know that the safety of his officers and his staff is, and of course of the public, is absolutely paramount in his mind.
Thank you. Christine Graham, to be followed by Liam MacArthur. Christine Graham.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Communities. Now, I welcome prioritising online access to supermarkets for those with shielding letters, but can this be extended to those in the vulnerable groups? Those in their 70s, 80s and 90s don't qualify under that, and those with underlying conditions who are finding it next to impossible to get any delivery slots from the major supermarkets.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Thank you, Christine, for raising that question. It's an issue that we are constantly looking to ensure that we can support those who are most vulnerable but not on that shielded list to ensure that they can access food. And alongside work and effort that's going in to engage with supermarkets and pleas to the public to try and ensure that if they are able to use and get to the supermarkets themselves, to not use the online facility to enable that to be freed up for other vulnerable people, we are engaging constantly with the supermarkets to see what more we can do and how we can support that work that you describe as so necessary. And that's why alongside this we established the national phone line, the 0800 111 4000 helpline, that is there to support people who do not have maybe their social network around them, that they don't want to go out into public places because of their vulnerability. So they've got a phone line that they can get then directed to their local authority to get some support that's on offer in their area. And I should also point out that we've also funded a number of organisations, one of which operates in your own constituency, Food Train, which operates in the Borders, and they're providing support to people across 9 different local authorities, 3,000 older people across the local authorities. So we're working with supermarkets, we're working with local authorities, and also we're working with third sector and community organisations to make sure that there is a package of support there in order to plug some of those issues that you describe, so that people do feel that there is somewhere and someone listening so that they can get access to food. But again, we're always keen to make sure that we can make that as good as it can be. So if you've got details, let us know and we'll try and work out what more we can do and make sure that those organisations that we've either funded or support are able to provide you with and your constituent with the support that they need at this really distressing time for so many people.
Thank you. Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Ruth McGuire. Liam MacArthur.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Can I start by thanking the Finance Secretary for her change of heart earlier this week in allowing businesses operating from multiple premises to make more than a single application for grant support? And can I encourage her to go further in addressing some of the remaining gaps? Businesses operating from home or not registered for business rates are still falling through the cracks. I appreciate this is a broad category in my own Orkney constituency. It ranges from B&Bs to boat charters, from businesses making small models to those operating surveying services. I commend Kate Forbes for the effort she's put in over recent weeks, but what reassurances can she offer that businesses in this group will not be left high and dry?
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
Well, I hope that shows that I am always keen to listen, and I know certainly that issue that Liam MacArthur has raised on a number of times was a key driver in changing eligibility criteria on Wednesday. So whilst I can confirm today that £215 million worth of grants have been distributed through the non-domestic rate system, which I hope will have benefited Liam MacArthur's constituents, it is important to note that our support goes beyond the grants and the non-domestic rate relief. For example, today's announcement on further support for the fishing industry, taking overall support for the seafood industry to almost £23 million will, I know, be of immense value to Liam MacArthur's constituents. When it comes to those that are falling through the cracks, although we've lobbied the UK government hard to expand support for the self-employed, this week we announced a further £100 million fund to support self-employed people and viable micro and SME businesses that haven't been getting the support they need to date. And that fund will be channeled through local authorities and our enterprise agencies to target in particular newly self-employed people and businesses that are ineligible for other forms of support. And I've got the tourism industry particularly in mind with that fund. So applications for that fund will open by the end of the month in the hope that payments can be made over the course of June, because I'm mindful of how critical cash flow is at the moment, particularly in rural areas where people often have more than one job. So I'm happy to keep colleagues updated on progress on those funding.
Thank you. Ruth Maguire, to be followed by Rhoda Grant. Ruth Maguire.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At this time where we're all having to make changes to the way we live our lives to save lives, can I ask the Justice Secretary what powers of investigation and enforcement that Police Scotland and their partners have deal with businesses and employers who are putting their workforce in harm's way by not fully implementing social distancing measures?
Humza Yousaf.
Well, first and foremost, the guidance in the law actually is an essential business in terms of our helping us in our fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. Then, of course, you should be closed and you should be taking a precautionary approach. For those that remain open, of course, you should be applying social distancing measures where that is possible. And every effort should be made, of course, to also allow people to work from home. In terms of the specifics of the question, where that is not being complied with, Police Scotland, of course, have the power to issue prohibition notices. There is obviously also the power to fine if necessary. If prohibition notices are not followed, if fines are being paid, then of course you could be taken to court, and in that action there's potentially unlimited fines. So a number of business premises already have been closed and been given prohibition notices by Police Scotland. I don't have the exact number, I'm afraid, in front of me, but I would encourage anybody who has concerns about local businesses, first and foremost, to be going to the local authority and speaking to the local authority, of course engaging with the business direct. There being no doubt at all that where police need to take enforcement action against the law, following the guidance, then they will do that.
Thank you very much. Rhoda Grant, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
This is a question for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. In England, a business that's eligible for grant funding can receive the same support for each business premise they owned. In spite of the improvements made in Scotland, a business will only receive 100% for one property and then 75% for additional properties. Can I ask if the Scottish Government will now replicate the UK grant funding as promised in order that we can support Scottish businesses during this pandemic?
Kate Forbes.
Well, we are going further than the UK government scheme, and that's why we've exceeded the Barnett consequentials available to support businesses. The announcement this week reflected the comments that had been raised by businesses to ensure that more businesses get support. But Rhoda Grant will know, particularly in the region that she represents, that the Scottish economy is far more dependent on small businesses, and our scheme in Scotland ensures that far more small businesses get support because our cut-off threshold is much higher in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and eligible businesses with multiple properties will now get further grant funding. Rhoda Grant will know that in England, because the grants are based on the Small Business Bonus Scheme, the Small Business Bonus Scheme is by design essentially restricted to one property in England, meaning that for the £10,000 grants, we are now giving far more money to multiple properties in Scotland than they would get south of the border. So it's important, whether it's now or through recovery, that we tailor our support to the Scottish economy. We ensure that we provide support to particular sectors, like we've done again today on fishing. And I think it's critically important that we push that funding as far as possible at a time where businesses are all struggling and money should be distributed widely rather than just centred in a few hands.
Thank you. Claire Adamson, to be followed by Donald Cameron. Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government. And with many families struggling at the moment and concerned, some will be struggling to meet their rent payments. And I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary what support there is for tenants who find themselves in this position, and where should they go for the help and advice that they need at this time.
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Thank you, Claire Adamson, for the question. And we immediately realised as a government that rent would be one of those issues that would become quite a challenge for many if they were immediately plunged into financial hardship as a result of the pandemic. And that's why provisions around rent and to avoid evictions due to rent arrears were formed part of the emergency legislation that was part. So we understood from the get-go that rent was an issue that we needed to look at and make sure that we gave people reassurance that in amongst the things that they're having to cope with, losing their home through rent arrears would not be one of them. I would say that there's lots of good advice on the mygov.scot website. There's advice for tenants there around some of the new legal provisions. They also should be signposted to advice on discretionary housing payments as well, or the Scottish Welfare Fund for other financial support as well. And for by some of those things that we as a government are taking forward in terms of action and financial support, I would also point to the very vibrant third sector and organisations there that also have good sources of support for tenants, for instance Shelter and others. But certainly mygov.scot has advice for tenants, and there should also be good signposting there for towards tenants towards advice on discretionary housing payments and the Scottish Welfare Fund from their local authority if they need additional support for crisis situations.
Thank you. Donald Cameron, to be followed by Willie Coffey. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a question for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. This week's partial U-turn on business support still sees firms in Scotland only get 75% of a grant after their first property rather than 100% as in the rest of the UK. So when the Scottish Government has decided to delay various policy initiatives such as aspects of social security devolution and early years nursery expansion as a result of coronavirus, surely the Cabinet Secretary could reallocate funding within the Scottish Government's own budget to improve support for business.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
Well, if Donald Cameron can identify where he believes I should remove money from in terms of either businesses that have received money here that haven't received it in the rest of the UK, or where and how I should redivert that funding from frontline services, then I'd be intrigued in the answer. We have exceeded the funding consequentials for business. We have topped that up with our own support, but we have got to cater for the unique challenges in the Scottish economy. And over 3/4 of non-domestic ratepayers in Scotland are in the small business bonus threshold. That is higher than the rest of the UK. That means that funding is going further, helping more businesses. But it does mean that with the limited resources we have tried to ensure that the support goes as far as possible. And this week's announcement in terms of providing funding for multiple properties is a result of me listening to concerns that were raised. But we are also trying to ensure that businesses that are falling through the cracks of the UK government schemes are also getting help. So at a time of extreme difficulty, and I'm acutely aware of the pressures on every sector, every industry and every part of the economy, it's important that this funding helps as many businesses as possible and ensures that when it comes to recovery and when we come to a point of trying to get the economy back to normal, there are businesses that have managed to weather these challenging circumstances with Scottish Government help. We've already removed the rates bill for a huge number of businesses. We have already delivered £215 million of grant funding to business. We'll continue to keep it all under review. But I think this week's announcement proved that the Scottish scheme is one of the most generous in the UK.
Thank you. Willie Coffey, to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Willie Coffey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's a question for the Cabinet Secretary for Health. She will be aware of the reports that Sir Kenny Dalglish tested positive with no symptoms showing. Would she consider testing all staff and residents in our care homes to allow us to pick up any similar positive cases earlier and therefore take action to protect everyone sooner?
Cabinet Secretary Jeane Freeman.
So there is a degree of debate still going on in the scientific and medical community about whether or not there is viability and robustness in testing people who are asymptomatic. What is absolutely robust, though, is that the tests work best and work with most reliability when you are testing people who are symptomatic of COVID-19. And the point of testing is something we need to remember. The point of testing in a care home setting, or indeed in any setting, is to determine the clinical management of the individual who tests positive. And in our care homes, in round about the middle of March, we introduced guidance, very clear guidance, that removed any communal activity from care homes. It's harsh guidance for the residents who live there, I completely understand, but it essentially says no communal dining, no communal socialising, no communal activities. That was designed to protect those residents in their own rooms with staff having the appropriate PPE so that we could protect against the transmission of the virus. Where residents now test positive when they did then, now we are testing all residents who are symptomatic, then that gives us additional information to ensure that clinical management is appropriate. But testing everyone really doesn't tell us any more than we currently know, when the point of testing is to guide our clinical management of the individual and to ensure that we have effective infection prevention and control. And that March guidance, if it is followed in every care home, and the work we're now introducing across our care homes will provide us with additional reassurance on that, if that is followed and staff have the training and the PPE that they need, then we are effectively protecting the residents as best we can, knowing, of course, that that's a difficult situation for them, made more difficult by the fact that visitors are also not allowed. And I know for family and friends, that is also a hard thing to come to terms with, but it is all about protecting our residents in care homes.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Stuart Stevenson. Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for Cabinet Secretary for Communities. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree that it's extremely traumatic for those not able to say goodbye to their loved ones who may die alone in hospital due to COVID, and that we need much better ongoing bereavement support for those such as my constituent who were denied the usual ways of being by their loved one's side during their sickness and after they had passed?
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Yeah, thank you, Pauline, for raising an incredibly important issue and one of the harshest consequences of what's having to be dealt with as a result of this pandemic. And of course, the social distancing rules mean that people beyond the initial and immediate family can't also say their goodbyes, or feel that they can't say goodbye in the way that we would all ordinarily want to. So we absolutely understand the importance of visiting loved ones in care settings, and during exceptional circumstances there's been guidance there that loved ones should be able to sit with relatives in the end of life situation, and that's been worked through. Some of that guidance has been worked through with Scottish Care, and I know today that the Cabinet Secretary for Health has also published and publicised the bereavement charter that has been developed with Scottish Care, alongside a number of other organisations that have an interest in making sure that there is support there for people at this desperate time. And I also know that officials are working with Cruse Bereavement around their online offering as well, to make sure that that online support is there for people who require it. Because of course at that moment of passing and that moment at a funeral, that's not when grief and bereavement ends. And so that ongoing digital support through the phone line that's on offer from Cruse Bereavement is also going to be ever more important. But again, you know, if there are other areas in which Pauline would like to get in touch again around some of the issues that she specifically refers to around the constituencies she has, and I know that she's written to me as well, if there are other improvements, then we'd of course like to hear about them, so to make sure that we can endeavour to offer the right and appropriate support in the safe way to people who are unfortunately going to lose loved ones as a result of the pandemic.
Thank you. Can I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Brian Whittle? Stuart Stevenson.
Justice Secretary, in view of the institutional nature of prisons, what special measures are the Scottish Prison Service taking to protect staff and prisoners from the effects of COVID-19?
Cabinet Secretary Humza Yousaf.
A range of measures. First and foremost, we've ensured, and the prison service has ensured, that there are adequate stocks of PPE for its staff. Of course, all staff and prisoners, following public health guidance, therefore, of course, self-isolating if they are symptomatic, or indeed self-isolating if somebody in the household is symptomatic. In terms of prisons, it's why some very difficult decisions have had to be made within our prison establishments. Probably the most difficult decision is to suspend visits. We know that undoubtedly is challenging for those in our care, but also clearly their families also, but really absolutely necessary to help us in the virus. What's been done in order to hopefully help with some of those difficulties and challenges is that we will explore technologies in order to continue to allow family contact. But in terms of the virus itself, it is a challenging, absolutely challenging environment. I have made no apologies for the fact that I think we should be increasing the numbers on home detention curfew to help us reduce the population. If we reduce the population, then clearly we can loosen the regime around prisons as well. And clearly, with the legislation passing on the 1st of April, that also gives the government powers for emergency release, which I'm very actively looking at and considering in a positive manner. And therefore, reducing that prison population will help us to potentially get down to single cell occupancy, which again will help us in relation to containing the spread of the virus within our prison establishment.
Thank you. Can I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Maureen Watt? Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Health. If I could go back to the PPE shortage that seems to be continually reported from frontline hospitals, GP surgeries and care homes, can I ask why it's taking up to 3 weeks for the Scottish Government to reply to Scottish companies offering to manufacture and supply this equipment? Does that indicate as perhaps a procurement and distribution issue for companies outside of an NHS preferred suppliers list?
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
No, I don't believe it does indicate that at all. The whole area of companies offering to become part of the supply list, offering either to reconfigure what they're currently doing or to offer additional supplies, is a parallel stream of work that is very helpfully being led by my colleague Ivan McKee. Now, in those instances, two really important things need to happen. First of all, we need to ensure, and this is all done very quickly, we need to ensure that the offer is a legitimate offer and not a scam. And I mean that with no disrespect to those very legitimate offers that do come forward. Secondly, due diligence needs to be undertaken on the company itself to ensure that what is being offered can be supplied. And thirdly, what is being offered needs to be checked to ensure that it meets the quality that we require for health and social care PPE. So all of that is led by Mr McKee with support from Scottish Enterprise and other colleagues, and they are pursuing that as quickly as they can. And indeed, one example that I'm happy to give of a successful effort was the company, I believe, Alpha Solway, who previously in their business model was a supplier to NHS Scotland. It stepped away from that, turned their production to other areas, have come back into this supplying masks, and we have just agreed a degree of not only support for them to re-provision their manufacturing capacity, but also the supply line that they will then deliver to us, not only now, but continuously, even as we go through this particular pandemic. That's important because it not only produces supply, but it produces new jobs in Scotland, much to be welcomed.
Thank you. Maureen Watt, to be followed by Michelle Ballantyne. Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is to the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Cabinet Secretary, the substantial impact of COVID-19 is being further compounded by the substantial fall in the oil price. What help can the Scottish Government, or indeed, since energy is still a reserved issue, the Westminster Government, give to companies in the oil and gas sector whose first preference is to make people redundant rather than to furlough?
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
I'm very aware of the issue that Maureen Watt has flagged. Not only is oil and gas production worth a considerable amount of Scotland's GDP, but obviously it's exacerbating the challenges on our economy. I'm aware that Oil and Gas UK have identified a number of specific gaps in the coronavirus job retention scheme, which complements some of the points that we've been raising regularly with the Treasury as well. Indeed, I've raised that in phone calls with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. And we have been asking the UK Government to consider 3 particular requests when it comes to the job retention scheme in order to mitigate potential redundancies, because our strong steer is that we expect employees to be furloughed, not made redundant. That is why that support exists. And briefly, those 3 asks are an extension to that scheme, a clearly defined end date for the scheme, and an assurance that oil and gas operators and service companies will actually be able to access the scheme. So we'll continue to work very closely with the UK Government and the other devolved governments to ensure that those changes are made, and to ensure that where there's clearly issues with one of the UK Government schemes, they are willing to adapt their scheme and respond to points that are raised.
Thank you. Michelle Ballantyne, to be followed by Mark MacDonald. Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you. This is for the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. As you're aware, businesses are still questioning the level of support they are getting to handle this crisis. And on Monday, you tweeted that you could do a lot more if Barnett consequential funding from the UK Government was based on business need rather than on population share. I wonder if you could explain why you believe this and what impact that might have on the economy going forward.
Minister Kate Forbes.
Thanks. I appreciate the question, because it's a point that's regularly raised by my counterparts in the Welsh Government and the Northern Irish administration as well in our quadrilateral meetings with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. So as the member will know, Barnett consequential is based on population share, and in each of the nations of the UK there is a slightly different economic need. So I've already mentioned that considerably over 3/4 of non-domestic ratepayers are in the small business bonus bracket in Scotland, and that means there's more of them, and our cut-off for the small business bonus scheme is 18k rather than 15k in England and 12k in Wales. I'm referring to rateable value there. So that means that more small businesses are getting a £10,000 grant, and it also means with the changes this week that they will be eligible for multiple grants if their properties are all within the small business bonus scheme. And by design in England, the small business bonus scheme is essentially restricted to one property. So that means that we are trying to push that funding as far as possible. I have a responsibility to make sure that businesses are getting the support they need, but it does mean that there's a gap between what Barnett consequentials can do in Scotland versus what we know is the need in Scotland. And that's why taking it on a sectoral approach, ensuring that we provide funding to particular sectors, is important. Just one last example, the announcement today by the UK government on fishing will see approximately £450,000 of consequentials come to Scotland. In contrast, our funding for the seafood industry now almost amounts to 23 million. 450,000 doesn't go terribly far. We've had to top it up to 23 million pounds. And that's an example of where we've had to take different decisions because of the need in Scotland, recognising that Barnet does not cover the unique needs in Scotland.
Now I can see that Michelle Ballantyne would like to get back in with a supplementary question. Michelle Ballantyne.
Yeah, you're thinking on this. Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can, Michelle. Yeah, thank you.
Given that the Barnet formula is going to come under review next year, your thinking on this is going to be very important with regards to the recovery of the economy, which, if predictions are correct, could be significant. So I would really like to understand if you're going to be coming out of this crisis and looking for a change to the Barnet formula to a business need-led model as opposed to a population share model.
Cabinet Secretary Kate Forbes.
So I've had a lot of very constructive conversations with the Treasury, because in this emergency scenario, obviously there's been questions around how quickly we can access funding, how the funding will be allocated, and whether, for example, you may be aware that Barnet consequentials are done on estimates, so they can still be clawed back at the end of the year as they were last year. So all of those issues have formed the substance of our conversation, and I've appreciated the constructive way in which the UK government has, for example, ensured that we can have the funding up front, ensuring that we don't have to wait till it becomes available, and that secondly, they have given us an estimate that they believe is as robust as possible, but it may still move later on in the year. So the point I'm making, and I've made to Treasury, is that at a time of emergency, sometimes you've got to park, well, you do have to park business as usual and look at the best means of supporting the economy. It applies even more so to our health system. So that's the point I'm trying to make, that when it comes to an emergency crisis like this, in order to ensure that businesses getting the right support, we may need to do things differently, and Barnet will never cover the business need because it's based on population share. We have more rural areas in Scotland, we have more small businesses, we have particular sectors that are disproportionately more important in Scotland. All of that is fact. It's fact that's regularly acknowledged by my Welsh counterparts and my Northern Irish counterparts as well, and I think understood by the Treasury.
Thank you very much. Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Neil Findlay. Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. My question is for the Cabinet Secretary for Communities. Much of the very welcome financial support that the Scottish Government has announced is being channelled through local authorities. And I received contact yesterday from a business in my constituency who first applied for grant support on the 24th of March, but to date have not received any determination on their application. They were advised by the local authority that the team dealing with the applications is very small, and as you might anticipate, they are overwhelmed with the number of applications that are being made. Is this a point that the Cabinet Secretary is aware of? Has it been brought up in discussions with COSLA? And are there plans to look at potential redeployments and secondments to increase capacity and get some of these applications determined quicker so that businesses can get that much needed support?
Cabinet Secretary Aileen Campbell.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Mark MacDonald, and I'm glad also that my colleague Kate Forbes is probably online here and will hear some of this as well, because I know that she has been working incredibly hard with local authorities to ensure that the support for businesses gets to the businesses that require that. Now, we also know that local authorities are working incredibly hard to make sure that they can also in a reasonable time frame to make sure that the support gets out the door, but of course there are lots of checks that they have to do in amongst that. But what we can do is if we can get the details of the company that haven't had their payment, if we can then use that as a means by which we can continue to have engagement with COSLA or Solace, to pinpoint where there might be some issues around capacity, and we can explore that with our local authority partners to make sure where there is a need to enhance that capacity, that they might think about that so that they can get the money to who needs it as quickly as possible, because I think that's something that we both share in our desire is between local government and national government to make sure that that money gets to who needs it and gets to them as quickly as possible. And I know that local authorities are working incredibly hard to do that, but of course there will be some bumps along the way, but we don't want that to be prolonging the agony for businesses who are needing this help as quickly as possible. So perhaps if Mark wants to share some of the details of that, we can then endeavour to make sure that those conversations are happening with COSLA in that strategic way, so we can pinpoint where there might be some geographical need for a bit more capacity, or to think about how we might address that.
Thank you very much. And Neil Findlay.
This is to Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman. The Scottish Government appear to have been COVID test sceptics from day one. In light of your answer to Willie Coffey, it appears you remain so. Do you stand by the Scottish Government's decision not to follow World Health Organisation advice to carry out widespread community testing? And will you give a clear, unequivocal commitment to immediately publish the advice given by your advisers that informed that decision?
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
So I think we've been through this many times, Mr Findlay. I wouldn't describe the Scottish Government as a sceptic on testing at all. We are busy ramping up our testing capacity. The advice that we've had has always been about the purpose of testing, and the purpose of testing has been threefold. In this phase of the path through the pandemic, and initially you'll recall it was about test, trace and isolate. We've now moved into the three purposes of testing. One is in terms of clinical treatment for patients in hospital, and now widening that. It was initially also clinical treatment for residents in care homes, but now widening that to all symptomatic residents in care homes. It was about community surveillance, basing it on the surveillance measures well in place that we've used for years around flu. And the third area was to assist those key workers to get back into work. And that remains the case. However, as we move, hopefully to a period where we can begin, depending on the advice we get, I'm sure you've heard the First Minister talk about that yesterday and again today, about how can we move, as it looks to be the case, that all the sacrifices and the efforts that people have made in following public health guidance about staying at home and only going out for those very restricted purposes, social distancing of 2 metres, households not meeting. It looks as if the numbers coming through seem to suggest that we are being successful at this point in suppressing the prevalence of the virus in the community. It's fragile at this point. We need to do a bit more, hence the continuation for 3 weeks. But we are planning now about how we would use testing in any situation where we might begin to raise one or other of those restrictions. And at that point, the testing capacity will be significantly increased by then in order to ensure that we can bring into our toolbox, if you like, much enhanced test, trace and isolate. So back to that containment approach, but in a much bigger scale. All of that, I believe, and from the evidence that I've seen and the advice that we've been given by our scientific advisors and medical advisors, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK, complies with the World Health Organisation, and they are content with the approach that we are taking. Of course, there's always more to learn, and we are very open to that learning. But that is the approach we're taking now, and the planning we're making in order to help those decisions that will come down the line about how we rebalance suppressing and containing that virus so our health service can cope with it, whilst we try and allow a greater step towards normalisation of how we can all live our lives.
Thank you very much. A very brief supplementary from Neil Findlay.
Yeah, I specifically asked if you will immediately publish the advice you have been given by your advisors on why we have not followed that advice, or indeed whatever advice you have been given on testing. Will you publish that advice?
A brief response from the Cabinet Secretary for Health, Jeane Freeman.
The SAGE advice is made public. I'm quite happy to send you what that website is where you can find it.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Can I thank all the ministers and all the members for their participation this morning, or this afternoon, I should say. Parliament is going to resume at Holyrood at 2 p.m. on Tuesday, the 21st of April. Until then, can I thank you very much for joining us, and I close this afternoon's meeting. Thank you.